Within Elite Dangerous exist many player factions, each with unique goals and missions for the game. And with so many different players, playstyles, and ideologies, war is inevitable. There have been several large player wars throughout the history of Elite, and while the Guardians War was small in comparison, it still turned many systems into a battleground. And unfortunately, due to the way the Xbox capture system works, most of the footage from this war has been lost. But it still gained some recognition from some larger out-of-game news sources. When fleet carriers first became introduced, they created a demand for tritium, and many commanders who did not want to mine the tritium themselves hired other groups to do the mining for them. One such commander was Dog Brandon H., the leader of a small player group known as the Guardians. The Guardians chose to hire a faction known as Blackstar for this mining job. Blackstar completed the mining contract and made an official alliance with the Guardians, and a little while after the mining contract, the Guardians hired Blackstar again, this time to increase their BGS. Again, this was completed successfully, and after the second contract was completed, the two groups went back to their own goals, and there was really no communication between them for a long time. In the meantime, Blackstar went on to join a coalition known as the Elite Xbox Stellar Alliance. The coalition held several long-standing factions such as the Deep Space Syndicate, Aurora Corps Interstellar, Sky Crew, and the Dark Side. I happen to be a founder of Blackstar, albeit at the time of joining the EXSA, I was on a leave of absence, and as it turns out, many members of the EXSA has encountered Brandon before, with Blackstar being the only group to have positive relations with him. In late January of 2021, 3303 in-game time, a new money-making method had been discovered using fleet carriers and wing mining missions, which were providing large payouts so commanders could stack large amounts of missions, jump a carrier to an extraction system, fill the carrier up, and then just jump it outside the dock, and easily finish 100 million credits worth of missions just by ferrying them back and forth. There was one issue. The system needed to be in boom, and finding systems that gave out large quantities of this mission was rare. And so when it was discovered that the Melange system was giving out these missions, many commanders flocked there to earn their credits. I do remember reading somewhere that gankers and pirates purposefully kept the system in boom to attract new players to kill, but I really never saw any confirmation of this. On the night of January 22nd, myself and several Blackstar pilots were in the Melange system, running these money missions when a well-known ganker began ramming us into the dock. After getting this ganker outside the no-fire zone, a battle ensued, and while the battle was a 4v1 with Blackstar holding the numbers, only 3 of the Blackstar pilots had combat ships, and of those 3, only 1 was PvP fitted, with the other 2 being stock, medium, or small class ships. Towards the end of the fight, another party joined in to help the ganker, Dog Brandon. Blackstar pilots avoided engaging him, continuing to fight only the ganker, but Brandon scored a kill on one of the stock ships, making him a direct threat. An immediate call for aid was sent out to the rest of Blackstar and the EXSA, and reinforcements from the EXSA entered the system, and the battle ended quickly after that, with both Dog Brandon and the ganker leaving the system. But Brandon had spilled blood, and against allies no less. After an attempted negotiation with Brandon, asking him simply to reimburse the $50 million for the lost ship, Brandon escalated the situation, talking about war, refusing to apologize or pay the money. After the negotiations broke down, Blackstar and the EXSA prepared for war. On January 24th, Blackstar and the EXSA officially declared war on Brandon. A message was posted in the Guardians Discord and a message to all their members, stating in effect, Brandon has burned or attacked each member of the EXSA in the past, and this time it cannot go unanswered. Instead of the measly $50 million originally requested, the EXSA was now requesting 1 billion credits to pay the pilots and the rebuys from the January 22nd battle. Additionally, Dog Brandon and the Guardians would not be allowed to fire on any EXSA members ever again. Dog Brandon was given 24 hours to surrender before any actions were made. During this time, Brandon began talking about shadowy figures that were after him and how we were just pawns in someone else's game. Before the 24 hours were up, Brandon had made his own demands, 1 trillion credits to be paid directly to him from the entirety of the coalition. The EXSA refused, Brandon refused, and war had officially begun. On January 25th, an official BGS campaign began in the Guardians' home system of Dvorsi. Within the first day, it was clear that the Guardians were not going to appear and open to confront the invaders, but gankers showed up en masse to fight the EXSA. It would later be discovered Brandon had been offering credits to pirates and gankers to defend Dvorsi and offered $1 billion to one group alone, with the total cost for hiring the Guardians' defense being massively more expensive than what the EXSA had demanded. As such, the EXSA command developed a strategy. To ensure Brandon lost his money and the EXSA members were not eating rebuys to non-Guardian pilots, all EXSA members would not engage gankers, only Guardians members, and if interdicted or attacked by gankers, would jump out. The gankers, who grew very bored, took Brandon's money and left. Several times Dog Brandon was engaged, but always ran, and the first day of the war passed without much actual combat. The morning and early afternoon of January 26 was filled with much of the same, engaging Guardians members only and BGS manipulation. But on the night of January 26th, the first large battle took place. In Dvorsi, Guardians began winging up with the gankers, allowing the gankers to drop in on the EXSA pilots faster than they usually could. Eventually, an announcement passed that all targets, gankers and Guardians, are cleared to be engaged. There's no clear winner in the engagement, but both sides took rebuys and had some high wakes. After a good few hours of fighting, both sides began to melt away, and it seemed the battle was over. At the height of the battle, there was 2 full instances of players and countless wings fighting, with over 5 different player groups taking part in the battle. As the EXSA wings were repairing and going over the battle, one EXSA leader received a strange message from one of the Guardians. He claimed that he wanted to set up negotiations between his faction and the EXSA. The EXSA were on high alert, but the offer was genuine, and Rusty, a high-ranking Guardian member, had been engaged in the fighting and found it pointless. He wished to bring both sides to peace, and so after several hours he was able to convince Brandon to come to the negotiation table. Negotiations did get to a rocky start, with many more people than necessary being in the Xbox party, but after some talking, we decided to limit it to faction leaders only, and the negotiations were able to actually begin. And surprisingly, it was working. Brandon agreed that attacking Blackstar had been a mistake, and he even said he was open to paying some reparations. Sensing the chance of a decent outcome, the EXSA lowered its request to a small 500 million credits and a public apology. Brandon himself even said that these terms were not too bad, and so it seemed we would be able to achieve peace. But Brandon's second in command, we'll call him Chef, joined the party, and Chef began saying that the Guardians could resist anything, and that Brandon had done nothing wrong. And just as fast as the negotiations had started, they were over. The understanding and reason displayed by Brandon was gone. He returned to the paranoid, unfriendly commander he had been before. In the early morning hours of January 27th, after the failed negotiations, the ganker restrictions for combat returned and the BGS machine chugged on. And after the failed negotiations, the EXSA began to realize one profound fact. Most of the Guardians did not even know what the war was for, with Brandon telling them lies, and this was confirmed by Rusty, who stated most of the Guardians had been told mixed messages about why the war had been started. As for Rusty, myself and several other Black Star pilots continued talking with him after the negotiations ended, and he stated that he felt like all the effort he had put into getting Brandon to the table had been ruined by Chef, and he did not have much confidence in his own faction's leadership anymore. Rusty would defect to Black Star later in the day, but he told us that he did not want to participate in the war, as he still had some friends in the Guardians. He wanted to maintain his friendships inside the faction. Instead, he would focus on making money only, far from the combat. Rusty tried to maintain his neutrality, but in less than 24 hours, Brandon had publicly accused Rusty of being a spy, and Rusty, who had joined the Guardians months before the war started, said that this was BS. Brandon then publicly added Rusty to the Guardians KOS list, and Rusty decided to fully join the war effort, stating, "If I'm going to be KOS, I may as well give them a reason." Rusty provided some intel to the war effort, saying that most of the Guardians had stopped fighting the war or listening to Brandon's orders altogether, and leaving Brandon with roughly 4 active Guardian pilots to fight. Later in the evening, Brandon, Chef, and the Guardians were spotted in the Baratheona system, the home of Blackstar, and several wings from the EXSA moved to engage, and a short battle ensued, but the Guardians jumped to a different system, and it was over before it really began. Towards the end of the night, the EXSA was back in Dvorsi looking for Guardians pilots and working on the BGS. By this time, Brandon and what little forces he had left rarely came out into the open, with large fights being rare. As such, the EXSA decided to implement a new tactic, psychological warfare. The plan was pretty simple. The Dvorsi system was filled with fleet carriers, with at one point every single fleet carrier spot being filled. All these fleet carriers changed their names to something along the lines of Surrender Brandon or Brandon Give Up. Some pilots took extra initiative, sending messages in the Dvorsi system chat, trying to appeal to his reason and asking him to give up so that they can go back to making money. But some pilots did happen to go overboard. January 28th rolled around, and it proved to be another quiet day. Most EXSA pilots have been doing nothing but BGS or PvP for several days by this time, and so we spent much of the day working on builds or discussing war strategy, but no real actions were taken. We did learn that we had passed the 20 squadrons mark on groups involved, and we also received a short shout out from Lave Radio. There were a few engagements where EXSA pilots tried to get Guardians members to be destroyed by carriers. Shout out to Chef for getting killed by his own carrier. And there were a few reports of Brandon and the Guardians having report crimes turned on, but no major battles or engagements took place. One EXSA pilot did mention that it was his most memorable part of the war. January 29th marked the last real day of the war, and a major battle did take place in the Baratheona system, with several squadrons and wings taking part in the engagement. After the battle, Anar had reported that 168 plus ships had been in the system. Once the fighting had ended, the EXSA returned to its patrols and BGS, but the Guardians were pretty much finished. The faction had 2 or 3 active members at the time, and all of them were hiding in private, and their BGS was in ruins. The EXSA pilots had grown tired of the fighting and began to look inward at what had happened during the war and what each faction had done. After the war, several EXSA factions got into a fight about breaches of conduct or ROE during the war, and the coalition went through some very turbulent times. Several groups left the EXSA, with most players just exhausted from the near constant PvP. After this, the Guardians' war was really over. Each faction would return to their own BGS or goals, with many of the bonds forged from the fighting lost. Based on the research and interviews I did for this video, I actually believe that this is also happened to be the last war of note to take place on the Xbox version of Elite, as Frontier announced that console development was officially over only a month or so after this. I remember the Guardians War as one of my favorite memories on Elite, and the politics, fighting, strategy, planning, and brotherhood are what I find to be a core part of the Elite gameplay. And to take part in what I believe is the last great Xbox player war was a huge honor. The squadrons fighting beside me were amazing at what they did, and even with the outcome, I learned a lot about the game and other factions and just PvP in general. This war is an example of what I think Elite is all about. A massive, immersive story adventure made by us, the players.